I can still hear the sound of that rain. Not a drizzle, not a gentle shower, but a downpour that split the sky open. It hammered the earth and turned the square of Ashridge into a pit of mud and shadow. Folks crowded beneath awnings, hats pulled low, coats drawn tight, yet they stayed. Nothing drives people away from spectacle, not even a storm that feels like judgment. And that night the spectacle was not cattle, not mules, not horses. It was a woman and her children. She stood on the block with 5 boys clinging to her skirt. The youngest was in her arms, his face buried against her soaked dress. They looked like a litter of pups, but she held them close as if her body was the only fence that stood between them and the wolves circling in the mud. The auctioneer bellowed into the storm, his voice carrying above the thunder. "Lot 12, widow, 5 strong lads, strong backs, fit for work. You can take one, you can take all, depends on your purse." The words were spit into the rain like sparks onto dry grass. I had seen cattle sold and horses traded. I had seen eyes go dull when the rope slipped around their necks and the deal was struck. But never, not once, had I seen children bartered like stock. My stomach twisted and I tasted bile. I wanted to walk away, to keep my head down and tend to the horses I had come to sell. But my boots held fast in the mud. My breath came tight and I could not tear my eyes from her face. She did not cry. She did not beg. Her chin was lifted, her mouth set hard like a line cut into stone. Rain slicked her hair to her cheeks, but her eyes stayed locked forward. She dared the world to see her break, and the world was eager to watch. Something in me cracked wide open. In that moment I remembered my own little girl. The fever had taken her fast, faster than prayer, faster than hope. I still hear her voice in the dark, calling me Pa just once before her chest stopped rising. I still see my wife's hands, cold in mine, both of them lowered into the ground the same week. The silence after, it never left. That was why I had come to Ashridge. Not for people, not for hope, but only to sell horses and buy grain enough to last another season alone. Fate does not care about plans. It shows you a mirror when you least expect it, and you see the things you tried to bury. I told myself to leave, to let the town have its cruelty, but the rain drove harder and the voices grew uglier. The auctioneer barked again, trying to pry the boys from their mother's arms. "Separate them," he called. "They'll fetch better apart." The men jeered. One pushed forward, waving a coin, reaching for the oldest boy. The boy's face was pale, but he did not cry out. His mother pulled him back, her eyes blazing though her body shook. That look sealed my fate. I felt my chest tighten, the air burning in my lungs. I could not stand by and watch another child torn away the way mine had been. My hand went to my coat, to the leather pouch where I kept the earnings of the last drive. It was too much for something this desperate, too little for what it really meant. My fingers shook as I gripped the notes, my heart pounding louder than the storm. "I'll take them all," I said. The laughter came quick. A man spat and shouted, "You marrying her too, McCall?" Another barked, "5 mouths and a widow's tongue, better you than me." I ignored them. My eyes did not leave hers. She studied me hard, as if weighing whether I was just another predator. She said nothing, but the smallest boy stirred in her arms, blinking at me through the rain. I pulled the wad of notes from my coat and thrust it into the auctioneer's hands. He hesitated, then counted fast and barked, "Sold!" The hammer struck the block. The jeers rose, mixed with the storm. But she did not flinch. She stepped down from the platform, her boys trailing behind like shadows, and for the first time that night I breathed. I led them through the mud toward my wagon. No one spoke. Rain hammered on wood and tin, and the only sound was the squelch of boots in the mire. I did not know what I had bought, what burden I had taken on, or what tomorrow would bring. All I knew was that I could not walk away, not again, not ever. We left Ashridge as the last echoes of the auction faded behind us. The road stretched out in a ribbon of dust, framed by the dry land and the endless Texas sky. The sun had started to dip low, throwing long shadows that crawled across the plain. I rode ahead, holding the reins of the wagon that carried Mary and her 2 children. The creak of the wheels was the only sound, sharp and lonely, cutting through the still evening air. No words passed between us. Silence weighed heavier than any burden I had ever carried. I kept my eyes fixed on the trail, but my mind wandered back to memories I could never bury. My wife Abigail, her laughter like soft rain in spring. My boy, Thomas, with eyes so eager, always running ahead as if tomorrow could not come fast enough. Both gone now, taken by fever that swept through the valley years ago. Their voices haunted me, whispering in every gust of wind, staring back in the faces of other families I passed on the road. Sometimes I wondered why I was left when they were taken. That question rode with me every mile. I glanced at the wagon. Mary sat stiff, hands folded in her lap, eyes downcast as though afraid of meeting mine. The children huddled against her, too tired to cry but too scared to rest. The little boy clutched a wooden toy, worn and chipped. He twisted it in his hands as though it was the last anchor to a world he once knew. His sister leaned against Mary's arm, watching me with a mixture of fear and defiance. I did not blame them. To them, I was just another stranger who had claimed them with coin. The trail turned rocky, and the wagon jolted hard. Mary tightened her hold on the children. Her lips parted, as if to speak, but no sound came. I thought I heard her whisper a prayer under her breath, a fragile murmur carried away by the wind. I pretended not to notice, though every word cut into me. I knew prayers whispered in desperation. I had spoken many of my own into the night sky, unanswered. We rode on, mile after mile. Coyotes howled somewhere beyond the horizon, their cries sharp and cold. The prairie seemed endless, as if it wanted to swallow us whole. My ranch lay still 2 hours away, tucked between low hills and the river that wound lazy but steady through the land. I thought of the empty house waiting there, rooms where laughter used to live, now filled only with silence. Bringing strangers into that house felt like dragging ghosts into sacred ground, but perhaps ghosts already owned it. The children shifted. The boy dared a glance at me, quick and shy, before turning his face into Mary's shoulder. I felt something tighten in my chest. I remembered the way Thomas used to look at me when he wanted to know if the world was safe. He had always trusted me to say yes. I had failed him once, and I feared I would fail again. Mary finally spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "How far is it?" 2 hours, I answered without turning my head. She nodded, her hand smoothing her daughter's hair. That was all. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. The road grew darker as night pressed in. Stars began to scatter across the sky, small points of light in the endless black. The children dozed, heads against their mother. I kept my hands firm on the reins, but my thoughts spiraled. I wondered what Mary thought of me, this weathered rancher with more scars than smiles. Did she see a savior or just another man who owned her fate? Perhaps she saw both. We crossed the ridge that marked the border of my land. The river glimmered faint in the moonlight. Beyond it, the outline of my ranch rose against the horizon, the barn leaning slightly to one side, the corral empty, and the house standing with its windows dark. Home, though it had not felt like one for years. As we descended the slope, the wagon groaned with every turn of the wheels. I could almost hear Abigail's voice in the wind, urging me forward, warning me, forgiving me. My chest tightened with every step closer. When we finally stopped in front of the house, I climbed down from my horse and walked toward the wagon. Mary lifted her head, meeting my eyes for the first time. There was no trust in her gaze, only exhaustion and guarded fear. I reached out a hand to help her down. For a moment she hesitated, then placed her trembling fingers in mine. The children followed, clutching her skirt. They stared at the house, at the darkness, at the unknown future waiting inside. I could not promise them safety nor happiness. All I could offer was shelter, and perhaps, in time, something more. We stood there in silence, 4 figures beneath the wide Texas sky. The prairie wind swept around us, carrying the weight of the past and the fragile hope of tomorrow. For the first time in years, I felt the faint stirrings of something I thought I had lost forever. Not peace, not yet, but the possibility of it. The first night at the ranch unfolded with a quiet unease, as though the walls themselves listened. When we entered, the air inside was still, heavy with the smell of wood that had not known warmth in many seasons. Dust clung to the corners, and the silence pressed down like a shroud. Mary guided her children close, her steps slow, cautious, as though the floor might break beneath her weight. I struck a match and lit the lantern on the table. The flame flickered, casting shadows that stretched across the wooden walls. The room looked smaller in that light, and lonelier too. I moved with practiced motions, setting out what little food I had prepared. Bread gone stiff with age, beans cooked earlier, a jug of water drawn from the well. It was not much, but it was all I had. Mary seated the children before I could offer. Her hands moved quick, careful, smoothing their hair, tucking them in against the rough wooden chairs as though they might splinter without her touch. The boy clutched his toy even at the table, his small knuckles white around it. The girl stared at the plate before her, uncertain whether to reach for it. I lowered myself into the chair across from them. My movements were heavy, deliberate, as though every shift of my weight carried the weight of years. The silence between us thickened. I cleared my throat, a sound loud in the quiet, and muttered, "Eat." "It's all there is." The children hesitated, eyes flicking to their mother. She nodded, and only then did they reach for the bread, small bites, cautious, as though the food might betray them. Mary lifted her own portion but ate little, more concerned with making sure the children had enough. I watched them, not out of suspicion but because I could not look away. The girl's eyes met mine once, sharp and uncertain, then dropped back to her plate. It was as though she wanted to measure me, to know if I was cruel or kind, if I would strike or protect. I could not give her an answer. My face, carved from years of hardship, told no story she could trust. The beans cooled as we ate in silence. The fire in the lantern wavered, casting light over the faces of strangers bound together by chance and coin. My mind wandered back again, unbidden, to nights long past when Abigail had set a table filled with laughter. Thomas had once reached across the table, his small hands sticky with jam, his smile bright enough to chase away every shadow. The memory stabbed at me like a dull knife. Mary's voice broke the silence at last. Soft, low, almost unwilling. "Thank you." Her eyes did not meet mine. I nodded once, words lodged in my throat. Gratitude was a foreign tongue in this house. After the meal, Mary gathered the plates, moving as though she had always belonged to kitchens. She washed them in the basin, hands steady, back straight, while the children leaned against each other, half asleep on the bench. I watched her in silence, wondering at the way she carried herself, quiet but firm, like someone who had learned long ago not to expect kindness, yet gave it in small ways all the same. When the work was done, I showed them to the spare room. It had been unused for years, filled with dust and echoes. I had cleared it earlier that day, not with care but with haste, tossing old blankets across the bed. Mary looked at the room, her face unreadable. The children crawled onto the bed, weary from travel. She tucked them in, smoothing the blanket over their thin shoulders, her touch slow, steady. I lingered at the doorway, hand resting against the frame. I wanted to say something, anything that might ease the fear etched into their faces, but the words never came. Instead, I muttered, "Good night." She looked up, met my eyes, and nodded. Her voice was a whisper. "Good night." I stepped back, closing the door halfway, leaving the lantern burning low in the hallway. Alone in my own room, I sat on the edge of the bed, boots still on, hat still resting on my knee. The silence of the house pressed in from every side. My chest ached with the weight of memory and the burden of strangers now under my roof. Outside, the wind rose, whistling against the shutters. Coyotes cried in the distance, their howls thin and mournful. I thought of the children asleep in the other room, of Mary watching over them with quiet vigilance. The house no longer stood empty, yet I felt no lighter. The shadows of the past still walked with me, silent but unyielding. I leaned back, eyes closing, though sleep did not come easy. My last thought before darkness claimed me was of Abigail's voice, echoing in memory, and the fragile thread of change that had entered my life unbidden. The house did not sleep easily that night. Though the wind outside quieted, the air within the walls carried unease. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the timber seemed louder, sharper, as though the ranch itself resisted the return of voices under its roof. I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling where the lantern's glow had left faint shapes before I had extinguished it. My body, though heavy with exhaustion, refused rest. Thoughts prowled my mind like wolves, memories of what once had been, the risk of what now might come. I could hear faint movements beyond the thin wall separating my room from theirs. A chair scraped, a whisper hushed, the soft weight of footsteps pacing. Mary was awake. She must have checked the children more than once, for I heard the faint rustle of the blanket being drawn higher, the quiet lull of her voice soothing them even in dreams. Her care was constant, unyielding. It filled the silence where my own voice would not go. I turned on my side, closing my eyes against the darkness, but another sound stirred me, the muffled sob of a child. The boy, perhaps, dreaming of the auction block, of the men's rough hands and the stares that had marked him like cattle. His fear seeped through the walls, and I could almost see him clutching that wooden toy as though it were the only shield he had. The sob grew quiet, replaced by Mary's soft hum, a lullaby that trembled but did not break. I had not heard such a sound in years. Abigail's voice had once filled these same walls with songs, lifting the night with gentle warmth. Now another woman's voice threaded through the silence, unfamiliar yet stirring something long buried within me. I rose from the bed, boots heavy on the wooden floor, and stepped into the hallway. The lantern burned low, shadows trembling along the walls. Their door was ajar, just enough for the glow to slip through. I stood there, hand hovering above the frame, listening. Mary's voice faded into silence, and the boy's sobs ebbed into slow, steady breaths. She turned then, sensing me. Her eyes met mine through the narrow gap, dark and steady, unafraid yet cautious. She did not speak, nor did I. In that quiet moment, the house held its breath. I nodded once, a gesture of recognition, of something unnamed. She returned the nod, barely perceptible, before drawing the blanket higher over the children. I stepped back, retreating to the shadows of the hallway. My chest tightened, though I could not say why. I returned to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and pressed my palms together as though in prayer. Yet no prayer came, only silence. Sleep claimed me in fragments, dreams broken and jagged. I saw Abigail's face, her eyes filled with sorrow, her voice calling my name in a tone that held both love and blame. I saw Thomas, his hand slipping from mine, his laughter fading into the wind. I woke with a start, sweat cold on my skin, the memory too sharp to dull. The night stretched long, unrelenting. The fire in the hearth had burned to embers, leaving only the faint glow of red beneath grey ash. I rose once more, walked to the window and pushed the shutter open. The moon hung high, pale and distant, casting silver across the fields. The land looked vast and empty, yet no longer mine alone. Behind me, the house breathed with the steady rhythm of the children's sleep, the softer, slower breath of Mary, who had finally surrendered to rest. That sound, faint as it was, felt heavier than silence. It pressed against me, reminding me that I was no longer free to vanish into solitude, no longer bound only to ghosts. I lingered at the window until the chill air drove me back. Pulling the blanket over my shoulders, I lay again on the bed. This time, my eyes stayed open, tracing the cracks in the ceiling until dawn crept over the horizon. When the first light seeped through the shutters, I heard Mary stirring. The scrape of a chair, the quiet padding of her feet, the faint splash of water at the basin. She moved with the rhythm of one who had long carried burdens, never waiting for rest to offer itself. The children stirred soon after, their voices soft, hesitant, as though afraid to disturb the fragile peace of the house. I rose, pulled on my coat, and stepped into the hallway. Mary stood at the basin, washing her face with cold water, her hair drawn back hastily. She turned at the sound of my boots, meeting my gaze without flinching. "Morning," I said, the word rough, as though unused for years. She inclined her head, her voice calm but edged with weariness. "Morning." The children peeked out from behind her, eyes wide, searching me as though still uncertain of the ground beneath them. I gave them no smile, no comfort, only the steady presence of a man who would not falter. Yet inside, I felt the first stirrings of a shift I could not name, the faintest crack in the armor I had worn for so long. The night had not given peace, but it had bound us in silence, in whispers, in the fragile thread of shared survival. And though the dawn brought no answers, it brought the first breath of something new, something fragile as glass, yet stronger than the ghosts that haunted me. The night Jessie finally told me the whole story, the air inside the ranch felt heavy, like the smoke of a fire that never really cleared. The boy sat across from me, shoulders hunched, eyes darting everywhere but mine. I didn't push him, I just waited, knowing that sometimes silence works sharper than questions. At last he whispered, "It was the fire, Pa. It started when Stroud's men came for us." His voice cracked like dry wood, and for a moment I saw him not as a lanky teenager, but as the child who had run barefoot through flames, trying to pull his brothers and sisters to safety. He spoke of that night with words that cut deeper than any blade. Their shack in the woods had been poor, but it was home. Stroud's riders had come after dark, torches in hand, demanding Mary hand over what little money she had saved. When she refused, they laughed and tossed fire onto the roof like it was nothing but kindling. The fire spread fast. Jessie said the heat peeled the skin off his arms when he tried to drag the door open. Little Thomas screamed until his throat bled, and Eli nearly fainted from the smoke. Mary had grabbed them all, pushing them through the back window while the flames swallowed the front room whole. They made it into the yard, but Jessie's father didn't. He'd been inside trying to beat the flames back with a wet blanket. By the time Mary realized, the roof had collapsed. Jessie said he still hears the sound of it, timbers snapping like gunfire, his father's last cry buried beneath the roar. I clenched my fists as he spoke, the memory of my own loss rising up to choke me. I knew too well the smell of burning wood, the way grief makes your chest feel hollow. Jesse's voice shook, but his eyes were dry. He'd run out of tears long before. Then came the worst of it. After the fire, Stroud spread word that Mary had no claim to the land, no proof of her husband's death. He said she was squatting, raising bastards without a man's name to shield them. Folks in Ashridge believed him because fear has a way of twisting truth. That's why I'd found her on that auction block, treated like cattle, because Stroud had poisoned the town against her. As Jesse's words sank in, anger burned hotter than any fire. Stroud hadn't just stolen their home, he'd turned their tragedy into a weapon, using the law and rumour to grind them down. The next morning, proof of that poison came riding to my door. A man on a bay gelding stopped at the gate, handed me a folded sheet with Stroud's seal, then turned without a word. I opened it with hands that already knew what it would say. It was an accusation, dressed in fine language but carrying the weight of a noose. It claimed Mary had no widow's papers, no record of her husband's passing, no right to live under my roof with her children. Stroud wanted the court in South Bend to strip her of custody and place the children in proper care. I spat in the dirt, knowing proper care meant an orphanage or worse, while Stroud lined his pockets with more cattle and land. When I showed Mary the letter, she went pale, but her jaw set like stone. She gathered the children close, whispering that no one would take them again. I saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had carried them through that night of hell, but I also saw fear, buried deep. The younger ones didn't understand, not fully, but they felt the weight. Eli asked if we would be sent away, and Thomas clung to Mary's dress, silent but trembling. I tried to smile, tried to steady them with words, but my voice cracked. The truth was, I didn't know what lay ahead. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, I sat with Mary by the hearth. She told me she dreamed of her husband every night. Sometimes he was alive, sometimes he was burning. She said Stroud's men had laughed as the flames rose, and that sound haunted her worse than the fire itself. I reached for her hand, rough and scarred, and promised I wouldn't let Stroud win. Not this time. My past had stolen enough from me, buried enough in cold ground. I would not let his lies put her and the children there too. When she finally drifted to sleep, I remained awake, staring into the dying embers. The crackle of the coals sounded too much like burning wood, and in the shadows I thought I saw the outline of my daughter's face, fading like smoke. By dawn I knew what had to be done. Stroud's lies had the backing of paper and seal, but I had something stronger, resolve born of grief. If the law wanted to drag Mary and the children into court, then I would be there, not as a bystander but as their shield, even if it meant standing against the whole town, even if it meant standing against the law itself. The sheriff came at dusk, his star glinting in the fading light like it carried the weight of all the law west of the Missouri. I was chopping wood by the corral when I saw him ride in, his horse sweating hard from a fast pace. My stomach turned cold before he even spoke. "Jonas," he said, voice clipped, eyes scanning the ranch. "Got business from South Bend." I wiped my hands on my trousers, met him halfway. He dismounted, pulled a folded paper from his vest and held it out like it burned his fingers. I didn't take it right away. Instead I asked, "This from Stroud?" His jaw twitched. "It's from the court. Don't make me say it twice." I opened it slowly, though my hands shook. The words were sharp, written by men who never smelled dust or blood. It was a summons, Mary to appear in South Bend, children listed by name, each one marked as wards of the state until proof of their father's death could be filed. Until then, custody would be reconsidered. When I looked up, the sheriff wasn't gloating. He looked tired, like a man carrying stones in his chest. "Jonas," he said quietly, "I don't want no trouble. But if she don't come, I'll be forced to bring her, with or without chains." Behind me, I heard the screen door creak. Mary stood there, pale as chalk, the children crowding at her skirts. Thomas clung to her leg, Eli's eyes wide as lanterns in the dark. She knew, even before I handed her the paper. Her lips trembled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she squared her shoulders and said, "Tell your judge I'll come, but I won't give up my children." The sheriff nodded once, almost with respect. "Court's in 2 weeks. Don't be late." Then he mounted and rode off, dust rising behind him like smoke. Silence stretched after he was gone, broken only by the sound of Thomas whimpering. I gathered the children inside, sat them down at the table. My heart thundered as I tried to find words. "They want to take you," I said finally. "But they'll have to go through me first." Mary's eyes found mine across the table. For the first time since that auction block, we weren't strangers bound by pity. We were allies, standing on the same side of a line drawn in blood and fire. Later that night, when the house was quiet, I sat alone by the lamp, staring at the papers again. Every word was crafted to sound righteous, but I could smell Stroud's stink between the lines. He'd bought half the town, and now he was buying the law. The memory of my own past came clawing back. The day I buried my wife and daughter, I swore I'd never let another soul depend on me. But here I was, with 6 lives tied to mine by fate and stubbornness, and the law was coming to tear them away. I could have walked away, many men would have, but as I stared into the lamp flame, I saw the faces of the children, Thomas asleep with his thumb in his mouth, Jesse sharpening a stick of wood to calm his nerves, Mary folding laundry with hands that never stopped moving. They weren't my blood, but they'd become my heartbeat. The next morning I hitched the wagon. Mary asked where I was going. To South Bend, I said. If Stroud thinks he can bury you with lies, then I'll be the one to dig up the truth. She grabbed my arm, hard enough to hurt. Jonas, you don't owe us this. I looked her straight in the eye. Mary, I didn't buy a family. I chose one. That means I owe you everything. For a long moment she stared at me, her lips parting like she wanted to speak, but no words came. Finally she just nodded, eyes shining in the morning light. I rode out with the summons folded in my pocket, the weight of it heavier than a rifle. The prairie wind cut sharp, but inside me burned something hotter than fear. Stroud thought the law was his weapon. He thought fire and rumor could break people, but he hadn't reckoned with me. I'd already lost everything once. I knew the taste of ashes, and I wasn't about to swallow them again. By the time South Bend's rooftops came into view, I'd made my choice. If the law wanted to call me an enemy, so be it. If they wanted to drag Mary's name through the mud, they'd have to drag mine right beside hers. Because I wasn't just fighting Stroud, I was fighting the fire that had stolen Jesse's father, the lies that had broken Mary's back, the cold emptiness that had tried to bury me years ago. And I swore, as God was my witness, I would not lose, not this time. I remember the way the wind carried dust through South Bend that morning, the kind of dust that gets in your eyes, in your teeth, and reminds you the land doesn't care whether you breathe or choke. I rode into town with my jaw clenched, reins tight in my hands. I wasn't here for supplies, or a drink, or a poker table. I was here to beg help from the only man left who might still know how to twist the law in my favor, Silas Kane. Folks used to call him a wolf in the courtroom, but now most just called him a drunk. His office was tucked above a saloon, the stairs creaking beneath my boots as I climbed. The smell hit me first, cheap whiskey and dust, heavy and sour. When I pushed the door open, there he was, slumped in a chair, shirt half-buttoned, eyes red and unfocused. For a second, I wanted to turn around and leave. What kind of fool was I, trusting my family's fate to a man who couldn't even sit straight? But then his eyes met mine, and in that brief spark I saw something that hadn't completely burned out. Kane, I said, my voice lower than I meant it to be. I need a fighter, not a drunk. He smirked, rubbed his stubble, and poured himself another glass. Jonas McCall, he muttered, as if tasting my name. You're the fool who bought himself a widow and her brood at Ashridge. Whole county's buzzing about it. Thought you'd last a week before running 'em out. I swallowed the sting. They're still with me, and if I don't do something, the Strouds will tear them away. That got his attention. He leaned forward, his chair groaning. Stroud's behind this? I nodded. Paperwork. Talk of missing certificates. Whispers about me being unfit. Sheriff's got orders in his pocket. Silas Kane's laugh was rough, like gravel in a pan. Hell, McCall, you don't need a lawyer. You need a miracle. But maybe I can give you half of one. He wiped his mouth, pushed aside empty bottles, and pulled out a stack of papers. Stroud plays dirty. I play dirtier. Question is, how far are you willing to crawl? I didn't answer right away, but he saw it in my eyes. I'd crawl through fire and glass if it meant keeping Mary and those kids. I didn't make it back to the ranch until dusk. The horizon was painted red, shadows stretching long. Something felt wrong the moment I saw Eli running from the barn, his face white as bone. "Jonas!" he shouted, voice cracking. "They got Jesse!" My heart dropped clean out of me. I jumped from the saddle before the horse stopped, grabbing Eli by the shoulders. Who? 2 men, strangers, said it was a warning. They dragged him into a wagon, headed east. His breath came in gasps. I tried to fight, but I didn't let him finish. My hands were already grabbing the rifle. "Mount up," I barked. "We're getting him back." Eli didn't argue. He was just a boy, but that night he looked older, harder, his jaw set like mine as we rode into the gathering dark, following tracks cut deep in the dirt. We found them in a grove of cottonwoods, their fire casting ugly shadows on the bark. Two men sat drinking, and in the dirt beside them Jesse lay bound, his face swollen, blood shining at the corner of his mouth. The sight tore something inside me I didn't know was left to tear. I raised my hand, motioned Eli to circle left. My own boots moved silent, each step measured, breath tight. The closer I got, the more I could hear, one man laughing, talking about how Stroud wanted the lesson to stick. The other spat into the fire, muttering about payment. I didn't wait. My rifle butt cracked against the skull of the talker, dropping him like a sack. The second man spun, pistol half raised, but Eli's shot rang out sharp, splitting the night. The man collapsed, gun clattering useless beside him. I rushed to Jesse, cut the ropes with my knife. His body shook in my arms, breaths ragged. "Pa," he whispered, voice weak, and I froze at the word. He wasn't mine by blood, but in that moment, hearing him call me that, I knew I'd already bled enough to earn it. Eli crouched close, his face pale but steady. "We got him," he said. "We brought him back." I pulled Jesse against my chest, the weight of him both breaking and healing me. The fire crackled behind us, the stench of blood mixing with smoke. I didn't know how many more nights like this we'd have to survive, how many more ambushes Stroud would send, but I knew one thing as clear as the stars overhead: I wouldn't let them take my family. Not now, not ever. The courthouse in South Bend smelled of sweat and ink, the kind of place where justice was supposed to live but more often just sat rotting. When I walked in with Mary and the children, every head turned, men whispered, women frowned, and somewhere near the back a rancher spat into a tin can as if to punctuate the contempt. I kept my chin up, but inside I felt the weight of every stare. Silas Kane shuffled beside me, his coat wrinkled, his tie crooked, but his eyes were sharp. He leaned close and muttered, "They're not here for truth, McCall. They're here for a show." And a show it was. Across the aisle sat William Stroud, clean-shaven, dressed like a banker, with his lawyer, a slick young man named Harper, ready to tear us apart. Harper's voice carried smooth and strong as he stood to speak, painting me as a reckless widower, drunk on grief, who had no business buying lives at auction. He called Mary a fraud, suggested her marriage certificate was forged, implied the children might not even be hers. Each lie cut deeper than the last, and I gripped the bench until my knuckles went white. Eli sat stiff beside me, jaw clenched, while Jesse still bore bruises that hadn't yet healed. Mary kept her eyes down, hands folded, though I could see them tremble. When my turn came, Kane rose, cleared his throat, and staggered just enough to make the jury lean forward, wondering if he'd collapse. Then, like a switch, his voice sharpened, slicing through Harper's honeyed words. He spoke of decency, of the right of a man to protect the helpless, of the sickness of tearing children from the only arms willing to hold them. For a moment, I saw flickers of the wolf he once was, pacing the cage, ready to bite. But Harper countered with papers, affidavits, signatures, claims that Mary's husband still breathed somewhere in the territories. "Without proof of death," he said smoothly, "this woman has no standing. And McCall, he is no guardian, merely a buyer of flesh. Is this what our county condones?" The judge's gavel struck once, the sound like a coffin lid. My chest tightened. I wanted to shout, to curse them all, but the law had bound my tongue tighter than any rope. That was when Mary stood. No prompting, no whisper from Kane, no nod from me. She just rose, straight-backed, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, and the whole room stilled. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "You speak of papers," she said, eyes locked on the judge. "But papers never fed a child. Papers never wiped tears or sang away a nightmare. My husband died in the fire that burned our home, though no clerk's pen marked the day. Do you need ashes in your hands to believe me?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Harper shifted, frowning. Mary's gaze moved to the jury. "These children are mine. I bore them. I bled for them. I carried them through hunger and cold. And this man," she turned, pointing at me, "has given them shelter when the world turned us into cattle to be sold. If that is a crime, then call me guilty, but I will not let you speak of us as liars." Her words struck harder than any lawyer's argument. Even Kane, for all his cunning, sat back and let her voice fill the room. Jesse's eyes welled with tears, and Eli reached for his brother's hand. The judge coughed, shuffled his notes, clearly shaken. Harper tried to object, to remind the court that emotion was not evidence, but his voice sounded thinner now. Mary's final words hung in the silence. Family is not written in ink. It is written here. She pressed a hand to her chest. And here. She touched Jessie's cheek. You can tear us apart with law, but you cannot erase what we are. For the first time since the auction in Ashridge, I felt the room shift. Not won, not yet, but shaken. The Strouds had money, influence, every trick the law could offer. But Mary had given us something stronger that day, a voice the whole county couldn't ignore. When we left the courthouse, the sun was low, bleeding red across the horizon. Mary walked beside me, her head high despite the storm still ahead. I realized then that it wasn't just me fighting for them anymore. She was standing shoulder to shoulder with me, and together we were more than one man's desperate gamble. We were a family, bound by fire, by loss, by choice, and that, I thought, was something even Stroud's money couldn't buy. The courthouse in Ashridge smelled of dust and sweat, and the wooden benches groaned under the weight of neighbours come to watch our fate. I sat stiff-backed, hat in my lap, eyes fixed on the judge, but every nerve in me burned like raw fire. Stroud had stacked the room with his men, their polished boots scraping the floor, their smug grins reminding me that this was more spectacle than justice. The bailiff called the case, and William Stroud's lawyer, a sleek fellow named Price, rose with the confidence of a man who believed the verdict had already been bought. He adjusted his cuffs, glanced at me as if I were no more than a stubborn mule, and began his speech. He painted Mary as a fraud. He said her husband was alive, working somewhere out west, and that she had plotted to sell herself and her children for profit. He called me a desperate old fool, so lonely I'd throw away money to play family. His voice rang across the chamber, sharp and polished, each accusation heavier than the last. I clenched my fists, nails biting into my palms. I wanted to stand, to roar the truth, to drag him by his collar and shove his lies back down his throat. But I had promised Silas Kane I'd hold steady, let the law have its chance. So I sat there, shaking, while Price spoke of forged papers, invented stories, and whispered that Mary might have enticed me on purpose to snare my land. Every eye in that room turned on her, some with pity, others with suspicion. Mary sat beside me, her face pale as parchment, hands trembling in her lap. The children huddled in the back row, wide-eyed and silent. My heart ached at their fear, and I thought, if this court tears them from me, I will not survive it. When Price finished, he leaned back smugly, certain he had driven the nails into our coffin. The judge cleared his throat, asked if the defence had anything to say. Silas shifted beside me, weary eyes searching for words, but before he could rise, Mary stood. The room gasped. A woman speaking for herself was rare, and rarer still in a case like this. She smoothed her dress with shaking fingers, then lifted her chin. Her voice wavered at first, soft as the rustle of wheat in the wind, but it carried enough strength to silence the whispers. "My husband is dead," she said. "I watched him burn in that fire. My children screamed for him, and I held them while the smoke swallowed his breath. Do not tell me he is alive, for I buried his memory with my own hands." Her words sliced through the chamber, sharper than any lawyer's trick. I saw women in the gallery press handkerchiefs to their mouths, men shifting uneasily in their seats. Mary's eyes glistened, but she did not look away. She told them of nights without bread, of walking miles with children clinging to her skirts, of standing at the auction block with nowhere left to turn. She did not beg for pity. She laid down truth like stones on a grave. "And this man," she said, glancing at me, "he did not buy us like cattle. He saved us. He gave us walls to sleep under, bread to eat, and a chance to live. If that is a crime, then punish me, not him." The silence after her words was deep enough to hear the floorboards creak. Even Judge Holloway leaned forward, eyes heavy with something that looked almost like shame. Price tried to interject, to call her speech irrelevant, but the judge raised his hand and silenced him. I felt tears burn at the back of my eyes. I had thought myself strong, a man hardened by loss, but watching her stand alone against that tide broke something inside me. In that moment, I knew she was braver than I had ever been. When Mary sat, the children rushed to her side, clutching her arms. I laid my hand over hers, rough and calloused, and whispered, "You did good." The judge announced the hearing would continue another day. That testimony and proof would be weighed, but as we filed out, I saw heads bowing slightly in respect, neighbours nodding, even a murmur of approval rising from the benches. The battle was far from won, but a spark had been lit. Stroud's lies had met a mother's truth, and for the first time since that cursed auction night, I felt the tide could turn. The night the fire came, I woke to the sharp crackle of wood and the bitter sting of smoke clawing down my throat. At first I thought it was a cruel dream, some phantom of past nightmares, but the heat pressing against my face told me it was real. The ranch house, my house, our house, was aflame. Flames danced along the beams like devils rejoicing, eating the timber I had raised with my own hands. For a heartbeat I froze, stunned, my body heavy as stone. Then Mary's scream jolted me into motion. I threw myself from the bed, yanking on boots without socks, the smoke so thick I could barely breathe. The children's cries pierced the roar of fire. I stumbled through the hallway, coughing, and found Eli dragging Thomas from his room, both half-choked and wild-eyed. "Get to the door!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah in my arms, her small fists clinging to my neck. Heat blistered my skin, but there was no time to think of pain. Mary appeared in the chaos, clutching Anna, her face blackened by soot. Behind her, Jesse stumbled, shielding the youngest with his own body. The roof groaned above us, timbers sagging, sparks falling like cruel rain. I pushed them forward, yelling above the roar, "Out! All of you! Out! Now!" We burst into the night air, gasping, coughing, the cold prairie wind slicing through smoke. For a breath I thought we were safe. Then Thomas cried out, "Pa, the barn!" I turned and saw it. The barn engulfed, horses screaming inside, their terror cutting through me like a knife. My heart clenched. Those animals were our livelihood, the blood of our survival. I thrust Sarah into Jesse's arms. "Take them away from the house," I bellowed. "Keep them safe." Then I ran toward the inferno, ignoring Mary's scream of my name. The barn doors were half collapsed, flames licking outward. I tore at the latch with my bare hands, searing my palms. The horses thrashed inside, eyes rolling white with panic. Somehow, by strength I did not know I had, I wrenched the doors wide. The beasts bolted, nearly trampling me as they fled into the dark. Fire roared higher, the barn groaning in surrender. I staggered back, coughing, my chest aflame. But relief surged, at least the herd was spared. Then I saw it, shadows moving beyond the firelight. Men. Not strangers, but Stroud's hirelings, rifles slung, grins twisting under the red glow. The truth seared me worse than flames. This was no accident. Stroud had struck at last, with fire as his weapon. Rage burned inside me, hotter than any blaze. "Jonas!" Mary's voice cracked through the night. She had seen them too. I shoved her and the children behind me, hand reaching for the revolver holstered at my belt. The flames turned night to day, and in that light I saw their intent clear as glass. They meant to finish us, to erase us. The first shot rang out, splintering the post beside my head. I fired back, the recoil jolting my arm, driving one man into the dirt. Chaos erupted, screams, smoke, bullets whistling past. Jesse clung to Thomas, shielding him. Eli grabbed a burning branch, hurling it toward the attackers. Mary pressed the little ones against her skirt, eyes wide with terror but unyielding. "Run!" I roared. "Get to the wagon!" We stumbled through choking smoke, past the ruin of barn and house toward the open field. Behind us, shots cracked, men cursed, horses shrieked. My lungs burned, legs quaked, but fear drove me faster. We reached the wagon, its harness still intact. I hauled Jesse up, shoved Anna into his arms. Mary scrambled in with the others. I seized the reins, voice raw. "Hold on!" The horses lunged forward, wagon jolting into the night. Behind us, the ranch burned, the only home I had built since burying my first family. Flames swallowed years of toil, and still Stroud's men gave chase, shadows galloping after us under the blood-red sky. Bullets whined past, one tearing the brim from my hat. I whipped the reins harder, the horses screaming, the wagon lurching over rough ground. Jesse huddled low, shielding his siblings. Mary clutched Anna so tight her knuckles whitened. Eli gripped the side rail, his face pale but fierce. Thomas whimpered, burying his head against his brother. I twisted in the seat, revolver raised, firing at the dark shapes behind. One rider pitched from his saddle, another reeled back, his horse shrieking. The rest pressed on, relentless. We raced toward South Bend Road, the only chance left. My arms ached, chest raw, yet I would not let go. Then I heard it, the sharp cry of Jesse. A bullet had grazed his arm, blood soaking his sleeve. My heart froze, terror clawing through me. Without thought, I leaned over, shielding him with my own body, pulling him down against me. "Stay low, son," I whispered, though my voice broke. Another volley of shots shattered the night, wood splintering, horses screaming. I braced myself, body curved over Jesse, as if my flesh alone could turn bullets. Behind us the fire roared higher, a beacon of ruin. Ahead lay only the road and the uncertain mercy of the law. In that moment, I swore, Stroud would not break us. I would carry these children through fire and lead and death itself. They were mine now, and I would die before I let them fall. The courthouse in South Bend smelled of dust, sweat, and old pine. I sat on the hard bench, my hat in my lap, Mary beside me with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles turned white. The children huddled close, eyes wide as if the wooden walls might collapse on us at any second. The room was packed. Ranchers, townsfolk, even drifters who wanted a glimpse of a family's fate. I could feel their stares boring into my back, some filled with sympathy, others with scorn. When Judge Halverson entered, silence fell. His heavy robes brushed against the floorboards, and his gaze swept the crowd like a hawk scanning the prairie. "This court is now in session," he declared. My throat tightened, the words sounded like the tolling of a church bell before a funeral. William Stroud's lawyer, a slick fellow named Price, leapt to his feet. His voice dripped with venom as he painted Mary as a fraud. He waved papers, shouted about missing certificates, and accused her of clinging to a dead man's name while latching onto mine for protection. Each word struck like a lash across my back. I clenched my fists, biting down the urge to stand and shout. Price turned his sights on me. "And this man, Jonas McCall, why, he's no savior. He purchased them at an auction like cattle. He is no father, only a buyer of flesh." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. I wanted to rise, to tear his lies apart, but Silas Kane, old and weary though he was, laid a calming hand on my arm. Silas rose with effort, his knees cracking like dry twigs. "Gentlemen of the court," he began, his voice hoarse yet steady. "The law is not meant to twist suffering into profit." He shuffled forward, holding a single worn ledger. "I have here records, proof of Stroud's dealings, proof of debts unpaid, proof that he sought to claim Mary not out of justice but out of greed." He let the book slam on the table with a sound that echoed louder than gunfire. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Murmurs spread like prairie fire. For the first time, I saw the crowd shift. Doubt flickered where certainty had been. Stroud's face turned crimson and Price sputtered, waving his arms as if to swat away the truth. Then Mary stood. Her knees trembled, yet her back was straight. She spoke softly, but each word carried through the room. "I never asked Jonas to save me. He chose. He saw my children treated as beasts, and he could not stand by. Whatever the law says, he has been a father to them. And I have been a mother. That is truth, whether you accept it or not." Her voice cracked on that last line, but she did not fall. She looked at each child in turn, then at me. My chest ached as though my heart might burst. Around us I heard sniffles, the shifting of boots, the clearing of throats. Hardened men bowed their heads. Women clasped their hands. Something shifted, like a tide turning against the wind. The judge tapped his gavel once, twice. "This court does not rule on sentiment," he said firmly, "but it does rule on evidence, and on truth when it stands clear." He opened the ledger Silas had provided, flipped through its pages and nodded slowly. The room held its breath. At last he looked up. "Jonas McCall, the guardianship of these children is hereby granted to you. Mary Caldwell, your standing as mother remains unquestioned. This family shall remain together." The gavel struck like thunder. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the dam broke. Cheers, applause, the stomping of boots. The children clung to Mary, then to me, their sobs mingling with laughter. I buried my face in my hands, overcome, tears I had thought long buried spilling freely. Stroud stormed out, his hat pulled low, Price scurrying behind him. No one followed. No one cared. The crowd pressed toward us instead, hands reaching out in blessing, voices offering congratulations. Mary wept openly, her fingers entwining with mine. As we stepped outside, the sun broke through heavy clouds. It spilled golden light across the steps of the courthouse, across Mary's face, across the children gathered around us. For the first time in years, I felt something unshakable settle in my bones. Not grief, not rage, but belonging. We had walked into that room as strangers fighting for survival. We walked out as a family, and no lawman, no greedy rancher, no shadow of the past could take that from us again. When we returned to the ranch, it was as though the land itself breathed easier. The smoke scars from the fire still lingered on the barn walls, the charred beams jutting out like bones of a half-buried beast, but the air smelled of rain and soil, not of ash. The prairie stretched wide and endless, painted in colours of late summer, and for the first time in months I looked upon it not with dread, but with a quiet sort of pride. The children ran ahead, their boots kicking up dust as they whooped and shouted, free from the weight of courtrooms and accusations. Jesse sprinted to the corral, checking on the horses as though to reassure himself they were still ours. Eli walked slower, stoic as ever, but I caught the way his hand brushed the wooden fence, gentle, almost reverent, as if he were greeting an old friend. Thomas clung to Mary's skirts before darting off to chase his brothers, his laugh sharp and bright in the still air. That laugh cut through me, tore through years of silence and grief, and left me trembling with something that felt suspiciously like hope. Inside the house, Mary set her hands on the dining table, tracing its worn grooves. She turned to me, eyes shining though her face was weary. "It feels different," she whispered, "like we truly belong here." I could not trust my voice, so I only nodded, placing my hand over hers. The wood was scarred, scratched by knives and years of meals, but under her touch it felt whole again. The first days were slow, like the waking of a man after a long fever. We repaired fences together, set the fields in order, cleared debris from the fire. Eli took to chopping wood without being asked, his arms straining with each swing, determination carved into his jaw. Jesse began mending saddles, his young hands clumsy at first, but growing steadier each evening. Even the little ones found ways to help, fetching nails, carrying kindling, filling buckets with water from the creek. I tried to keep my distance at first, unsure of how to step into the space of fatherhood without breaking it. Yet every time I turned, I caught their eyes on me. Jesse watched how I lifted beams, mimicking my grip. Thomas trailed after me in the mornings, his tiny boots nearly swallowed by the grass, asking questions about cattle and storms and whether the sun would always rise in the east. And Eli watched me hardest of all, silent, guarded. But I saw it, the way his shoulders eased when I praised his work, the way his eyes softened when I sat beside him at supper. Evenings became something different altogether. Where once silence pressed on us like a coffin lid, now voices filled the house. The children argued over chores, laughed at one another's clumsy mistakes, asked Mary for more bread, more stew, more everything. She obliged with a smile, her hair coming loose as she moved about the kitchen, and I, who had once eaten alone for so many years, found myself lingering at the table long after plates were cleared, just to hear the sound of them. One night, as the lantern flickered low, Jesse looked across the table at me. "Pa," he said, casual as if he'd spoken it 100 times. The word struck harder than any bullet I'd ever taken. Mary froze, her eyes darting to mine, but I could not speak. My throat closed, my heart thundered, and all I managed was a nod. Yet in that nod, I think he saw everything, my gratitude, my fear, my love, all tangled together. After the children had gone to bed, I stepped outside. The prairie wind swept over me, cool and full of cricket's song. The stars burned clear, brighter than I had remembered. I thought of my wife and daughter, gone to the earth years ago. For so long I had believed my story ended with them. Yet here I was, standing under the same sky, with laughter echoing from the house behind me. Perhaps grief never leaves, but perhaps it can share space with something new. When I went back inside, Mary was waiting at the hearth. She didn't speak. She simply placed her hand against my chest, over my heart. Her touch steadied me, like the ground after a storm. In that moment I knew, the law had granted me guardianship, but it was the children and Mary who would grant me fatherhood, and I would not squander it. That night I slept deeply for the first time in years, the weight of the world lifted, replaced by the softer burden of belonging. The ranch was no longer just mine, it was ours. When we first rode back to the ranch after everything in town, the land looked older, lonelier than I remembered. The fences sagged, the barn door hung half off its hinge, and the fields lay choked with weeds. Once, this had been a place full of work and laughter. Sarah's voice had filled the porch while the boys played, her bread cooling on the sill. Now it felt like the ghost of all I had lost. Mary sat straight in the wagon, her eyes scanning the horizon as if she were trying to picture herself there. The children huddled together, quiet, their faces caught between fear and a fragile hope. I could feel their questions pressing against me. Would this place be safe? Would it finally be home? We spent the first night crowded into the main room. I lit the stove with kindling that had grown damp, and the smoke stung my eyes. Mary knelt to unpack bread she had saved, dividing it carefully so each child had a fair piece. Watching her, I felt something shift inside me. The house that had been empty for years now breathed again, warmed not by fire alone, but by the presence of people who needed me. The days that followed were hard. I patched roofs, mended fences, and dug out the weeds choking the field. Mary washed and scrubbed until her hands cracked. The children tried to help, clumsy but eager. Each nail I hammered, each board I straightened seemed to drive out the silence that had haunted the ranch. The land itself seemed to wake, stretching like an old dog at dawn. Yet amid all the labour, something gentler began to grow. Clara started humming as she swept. Jessie scowled less. Even little Thomas laughed when Eli carved a crooked whistle from a branch. It was like watching colour seep back into a faded painting, and in the centre of it all was Mary, steady as the cottonwood tree down by the pasture. It was beneath that very tree that Mary and I chose to wed. We had no preacher, no congregation, only Silas Kane, the same lawyer who had stood by us when the world turned cruel. He read from a Bible his hands trembled to hold, and I swear the prairie itself hushed to hear. I wore the black coat that had carried me through funerals and Sundays alike, the threads thin but clean. Mary wore a dress she had sewn from scraps, plain but beautiful in its honesty. Her hair loosened around her face, and when I saw her standing there with the sun catching in the strands, I felt something I had thought dead stir inside me again. The children gathered close, Jessie pretending he wasn't excited, Clara smiling shy, Eli staring as though the vows themselves were magic. When Silas asked me if I would take Mary as my wife, I thought of Sarah's grave, of the hole her death had left. My voice shook, but it held when I answered, "I do." Mary's answer was clear, strong as a river's current. "I do." And with that, the weight I had carried for so long lifted. I kissed her under the cottonwood branches, and for the first time in years, laughter rang out across the ranch. The children clapped and whooped, their voices echoing like a promise. This was not just survival anymore, it was the start of something new. That evening we broke bread together beneath the same tree, the sky streaked with gold. No feast, only what we had, but it was enough, more than enough. As the sun dipped low, Mary leaned into me, the children chasing fireflies across the yard. The ranch that had once been a tomb now pulsed with life again, and I knew we had truly come home. In the weeks that followed our vows under the cottonwood, the ranch began to hum with a rhythm that felt almost like music. Not the loud, brash kind you'd hear spilling out of a saloon, but the quiet tune of chores done side by side, of boots scuffing along the porch, of children's laughter weaving into the wind. Each day carried its share of hardship, but somehow the weight grew lighter when carried together. Eli was the first to show signs of settling in. That boy had sharp eyes and restless hands, always looking for something to shape or mend. One afternoon I found him sitting on the porch steps with my old whittling knife, shavings of pine scattered at his feet. At first I thought he was just hacking wood, but as I looked closer I saw a small horse beginning to emerge beneath his hands. The way he concentrated, tongue poking at the corner of his mouth, reminded me of myself when I was his age, bent over scraps of lumber, trying to make sense of the world through my hands. "You've got a knack for it," I told him. Eli looked up quick, suspicion in his eyes like he expected to be scolded, but when he saw I meant it, his shoulders eased. He held the carving out for me to see, and for the first time since I'd known him, pride softened his face. That night he asked if I could show him how to sharpen the blade properly. It wasn't much, but it was the start of trust, built not with grand gestures, but with quiet hours side by side. Jessie was slower to come around. That boy had a wall built high, and I can't blame him. The world had taken too much from him already. Still, the wall cracked one evening when we were fixing a fence line together. The sun was dipping, casting long shadows, and he asked me sudden, without looking up, "You gonna stick around, or you gonna leave us too?" The question cut deeper than any blade. I laid my hammer down, looked him square and said, "I ain't going nowhere, son. You hear me? Not now, not ever." He didn't answer right away, just kept pounding the nail like he hadn't heard. But when we walked back to the house, his hand brushed mine for just a moment, quick as a flash, like he wanted to believe me but was scared to say it out loud. It was a week later, at supper, that Jessie finally let the word slip. Mary had made stew from beans and the last of the salt pork, and we all sat crowded around the rough-hewn table. I asked him to pass the bread, and he grumbled, "Here, Pa." The word hung there, heavy and sweet, like thunder before rain. He froze, realizing what he'd said, but I didn't correct him. I just nodded, steady as I could, and answered, "Thank you, Jessie." Mary's eyes shone across the table and Clara reached under the bench to squeeze her brother's hand. From that night on, the wall was never quite as tall. Then came the evening that sealed it all. We'd been working hard, long days in the field and around the barns, and Mary decided we needed a proper meal, something more than scraps. She pulled together what she could: fresh bread, boiled potatoes, a chicken we'd raised. The children helped, Clara setting the table, Eli whittling little holders for the candles, Jessie chopping wood for the fire without complaint. When we finally sat down, the smell of roast chicken filling the room, it felt like a holy thing. The flicker of candlelight danced across their faces, turning the rough table into something grander than any hall I'd ever seen. For the first time in years, I heard laughter at supper. Real laughter, not forced or fleeting, but the kind that bubbles up from a heart finally safe enough to let go. Eli told a story about carving the horse. Clara teased Jessie until he blushed, and little Thomas smeared potatoes across his cheek, setting us all to laughing harder. Even Mary, who had carried so much weight on her shoulders, leaned back and laughed until tears streaked her face. I sat there, spoon in hand, looking around at them all, and I realized this was family, not by blood alone, but by choice, by sweat, by love that had been tested in fire and found true. The ranch that once echoed with silence now rang with voices, with clatter and song, and for the first time in a long time I dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, we were going to be all right. Life on the ranch did not change in a single sunrise. It was slow, like grass pushing through the soil after winter, yet every day carried a trace of newness. I woke earlier than I used to, listening to the shuffle of small feet across the floorboards. The children were already moving with purpose, fetching water, carrying wood, chasing the hens out of the garden patch. Their laughter carried across the yard, replacing the silence that once clung to these walls. Even the land seemed to sense the difference. The cattle grew strong, fences held, and the wheat bent gold in the breeze. What had once been a place of dust and memory was alive again, not just with work, but with belonging. Mary brought a rhythm that none of us had known before. In the afternoons, when chores were done, she would gather the younger ones around the table and open a tattered primer, her voice patient as she traced letters on the page. Their heads leaned close, lips stumbling over words, and in their eagerness I saw futures stretching wider than this ranch, wider than anything I could have given them alone. At night, when I passed by the kitchen, I would hear her humming while she kneaded dough, the sound tender and steady, as if it held the whole house together. And it did. The children themselves were changing too. Jessie no longer guarded every word. Eli had taken to whittling, carving shapes from cedar branches and pressing them into my hands with shy pride. Clara, once so solemn, laughed easily now, sometimes at nothing at all. And Thomas, sweet Thomas, still stumbled sometimes and called me Pa, as if by accident, but I no longer corrected him, because by then it wasn't an accident at all. I had become what they needed, and in turn, they had become what I had thought I'd lost forever. One evening, when the air was warm and the prairie smelled of cottonwood sap, I asked Mary to walk with me. We went to the tree where we had first spoken vows in desperation, under smoke and threat. This time, I had a small silver band tucked in my pocket, bought after months of careful saving. My knees ached as I knelt, but my voice was clear. "Mary," I said, "once I promised before God and wind to keep you safe. Tonight I ask again, with all that I am, will you be my wife?" Her hand went to her mouth, and for a moment the world was still, nothing but her eyes and mine. Then she nodded, tears slipping free. The children, who had followed at a distance, cheered so loud the cattle stirred. Weeks later, we married proper, with neighbours gathered, stew and bread on the tables, and the prairie sky wide as a cathedral above us. Since then, nights have carried a gentleness I never imagined I'd know again. After supper, the children crowd near the fire, heads leaning on my arms, their eyes heavy with sleep. They ask for stories, some true, some not, and I tell them of wild horses and rivers that cut through stone, of storms I outran and dreams I once had. Mary sits nearby, her sewing in her lap, smiling softly as though she, too, is listening like a child. And when one by one they drift into sleep, I sit in the quiet and realize the ranch is no longer just a place to live, it is home. At dawn, when the first light spills across the plains, I step outside and breathe in the cool air. The sky turns from grey to gold, the grass shimmering like an ocean under the sun. I hear the voices of my children stirring, Mary's laugh rising from the kitchen, and the steady rhythm of life that has grown from ashes. Once I thought my story had ended in grief and loneliness, but the prairie has given me something I never dreamed I'd find again, not only a family, but peace. And as the horizon opens before me, endless and bright, I know that this time it will last.